So it's 7:05. Let me just give a quick introduction about poetry. Prakriti. Welcome everyone. We are glad you could join us. Prakriti Foundation is an arts and culture NGO in Chennai, founded in 1998, and it has been a space where scholars, researchers, artists, critics, poets, and filmmakers have been able to present their work to those who engage with it on serious terms. One of its four annual festivals, Poetry with Prakriti, features eminent and emerging poets from India and abroad, presenting to small, intimate audiences at several venues in the city: schools, colleges, cafes, galleries, boutiques, banks, IT parks, green public parks, and other commercial establishments. Due to travel and public gathering restrictions, Poetry with Prakriti is online this year and with readings on the first 3 Saturdays of every month, bringing you poetry via your computer or smartphone screen. We are mindful of the video conferencing fatigue. So these are short events, around 15 minutes of reading a different poet each time, followed by a Q&A session with a poet. We've had sessions already with poets like K.K. Daruwala, Pirmal Murugan, Priya Sarkai Chavriya, Danish Hussain, K. Srilata, and this week we have Mr. Ranjit Hoskote. In the months ahead until next year this time, when hopefully we will be able to have a more conventional festival, Prakriti Foundation will bring you more and more poets, some well-loved, others who have not yet got wider audiences. With this, I request all of you to uh, stay back and enjoy the poetry readings, and a few things to remember. We will take question and answers after the reading, where everybody, if you can see, there is a Q&A box below, and please restrict your questions to the Q&A box. And if you want to pass along comments to each other or to appreciate the poet or poem, please restrict that to the chat box, and keep the question and only questions to the question and answer box, which will be taken up at the end by the poet. And yeah, with this, I welcome Dr. Archana from Anadarsh College of Chennai, knowledge to introduce the poets today. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. We've heard these ideas bandied all the time that the poet writes best in isolation, ruminating in the recesses of his own minds, marinating in his own thoughts. The ivory tower he inhabits is an essential ingredient to his creative process. But it's not these thoughts that render these cliches redundant when we speak about the poet for this evening's poetry session. What makes a poet for today's Prakriti session stand out is also his ability to don multiple hats, which he wears with such accomplished ease: poet, writer, translator, curator, cultural theorist, art critic with an abiding interest in anthropology, archaeology, astronomy, linguistics, architecture, religion, philosophy, and spirituality. Now, I have just one question. Mirror, mirror on the wall, is there any field Ranjit cannot jeet at all? It's my sheer delight and absolute pleasure to introduce the poet of the evening today, one of the definitive and most representative voices of contemporary poetry. Hoskote has always believed in the collaborative verse with exchange and interchange of ideas. While traversing both the elite and the egalitarian, one wonders if anything escapes his observant eyes. With 30 books to his credit, he's the author of 5 collections of poetry. His poems have appeared in Indian and international journals and in prestigious anthologies, including Language for a New Century. In 2011, Hoskote was invited to act as the curator of the first ever professionally curated National Pavilion of India at the Venice Biennale, organized by the Lalit Kala Academy. He he had organized the same at South Korea. His poems have been translated into German, Hindi, Swedish, Spanish, Gaelic, Irish. It's a long list. Hoskote has been a visiting writer and fellow of the International Writing Program at the University of Oahu and was writer in residence at the Villa Belveta, Munich. He has also held a writing residency as part of the Goethe Institute Polanische Institute project. He was awarded the Sanskriti Award for Literature in 1996 and won first prize in the British Council Poetry Society All India Poetry Competition Award in 1997. India's National Academy of Letters honored him with the Sahitya Akademi Golden Jubilee Award in 2004. The S.H. Raza Foundation conferred its 2006 Raza Award for Literature in 2000 on him. His latest books of poems, An Atlas of Lost Beliefs, has won the Poetry Book Society recommendation for the summer 2020. Hoskote has held an associate fellowship with Sarai, a new media initiative of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, New Delhi, and is in the process of bringing out a journal on art. Today, we all hope to glow in the words of the poet. Thank you so much. It's indeed a pleasure to have you. I now hand over the session to Arshia Sattar. Thank you so much.
Thank
Hello,
you.
dear Ranjit. How nice to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, so without further ado, do read the poems. I feel very fortunate that I got to read them before anybody else. So I'll just say that much for our audience. They are truly, truly amazing. So Ranjit, please.
Thank you so much. Also, let me just say that it's a particular pleasure to be here. I want to thank everybody at Poetry at Prakriti, at the Prakriti Foundation. Ranveer and Meera are here, Harish and Santosh, and the team. Archana, thank you so much for your very warm and generous words of welcome. Each time I hear my multitude of sins, I feel, oh my goodness. But there are very many things that are indeed beyond me. Nuclear physics, I don't know a thing about it, for instance. But I always feel that, in the presence of the world, you're returned to a place of curiosity and of learning, and that's a position that I'm quite happy with, because it also then makes sure that you never get too complacent about anything. And Arshia, I'm deeply honored to have you as the chair and interlocutor. Your work has been very, very inspiring from early on. As a Sanskritist, as a storyteller, the seminal work you've done on parsing and interpreting the Ramayana, of which we'll speak more, I think, at some point this evening. So what I thought I'd do is maybe I'll start with 3 poems, which all have, I realize, something or the other to do with the life of the seeker, the quester, maybe. The first poem that I'm going to read is from Vanishing Acts, and it's called The Sufi in Winter, and it goes like this. The hem of a robe, a tree's calloused bark, a frosted beard, a whiff of musk, dust on a turban. Nothing is lost in translation, not even a woolen sleeve smelling of wood smoke. And I'll move now to a poem called Landscapes with Saints, which is in 7 small parts. It revisits various saints, saint poets, heroic saints, recluses whose lives and whose work has fascinated me. They're miniature portraits. So Landscapes with Saints. Mean as knives, his burnished limbs, rotted and stank when the gateman came to call his number. Gorak forgot. His body was just a borrowed suit, one size too large. He's forgotten the river pilot's song. He's above parrot gossip, beyond the hawk's warning cry. Wrapping himself in the torn fabric of sky, Kabir climbs on. Dropping his nimbus in the grass, he looks at the boats riding the stream below, close enough to touch. When the road ends, Tuka takes a deep breath and leaps. She sees a boatman rowing in sand, shielding his skiff from the ocean's roar. Such a safe harbor, brother, sings Lalla. It saves you the trouble of charting your course. His eyes would not rest on a quatrain of walls and scanned the desert air instead. Mango trees balancing on their heads. Himself, Khushru, a bird of paradise, judged by earth. Neglect leafs through his pages. Perfumes escape from files left unstoppered on his shelves. Lead crumbles in Attar's mind. His hands, wherever they rest, touch gold. A torn cotton robe against the wind, his limbs nettle pricked, transparent as prayers. His name burnt out, Milarepa sings to himself as he travels the centuries. And I'm going to move to another book, Central Time, for a poem that's simply called For Example. And those of you who know Cartier-Bresson's photographs of the last days of Ramana Maharishi will recognize who's at the center of this portrait. For example, the saint maintains his piety through the graphic imagination of other people's vices. We thank him for it. The saint's impossible perfection allows us to go on being gargoyles while keeping our faith alive. We admire him for it. The saint's silence covers far more than our interpretations of it. The saint has stood in the cave of light. He has spoken to the spirits of trees. His poetry is the fan of the white peacock opening against the rough shrubbery of our speech. And I'm going to switch modes now and read a few poems that have to do with how to tell stories in difficult times. How do you encode this? What happens? How do you speak of a shock or a deep trauma? Since it's been 28 years since a certain incident that divided us and damaged us, I'm going to read a poem called Dome. And it's dedicated to a dear friend, poet and architect, Masood Taj. So Dome for Masood. Dates never change on the calendar of faith, but light and wind are playing tricks with the past. Words split like isotopes in this peacetime landscape of abandoned courtyards, empty cradles, withered gardens, broken roofs. Only the madman in his garland of dried flowers has the right of passage here, and the blind beggar who recollects nothing except the spider ticking in his wired skull. For a second, between two versions of an echo, the past doesn't happen. The dome remains a rock's egg, veined blue, shelled by wind. Confess to no crime of identity. Wait until the guillotine falls in the vast silence of the heart. I'm now going to switch place and time and read a poem called The Sword Maker's Lullaby for the Infant Prince. This comes from a deep fascination with certain Spanish royal portraits, which often have, from a particular period, which have in the princess and infanta surrounded by all the paraphernalia of the life they're going to grow up into. And this strange paradox between childhood and what that kind of life entails. So the sword maker's lullaby for the infant prince. It goes like this. The new sword recalls no blood. The old sword tastes again the wheeling seasons of slaughter. Horses neigh, falcons cry, men crashing into ditches, arrows in their throats, heads rolling downhill on streams of flies, helmets catching the noon glint, hedges of blade glare, mowing, hacked. Old steel is best. Hilt firm, fire-honed edge. It slashes through the honeycomb fabric of treaties and intrigues, dresses the torn flesh to sing in mummers' tales. Cunning as poets, the oldest swords can drowse on your walls, but roused will recite the butcher's anthems bird beneath our tongues. Yes, even yours, little boy among the dreaming spaniels. And again, I switch continents, come back closer home. In fact, in my case, very close to a home that I lost a long time ago. I'm thinking here of Shahid's lines, Aga Shahid Ali's lines, and this is home. This is the closest you'll ever be to home. This poem's called Reading a Script at Ziyarat Dastgir Sobun, and began really during a trip to Srinagar in 2005. Ziyarat Dastgir, for those who may not be familiar with that topography, is one of the most beautiful of the Sufi shrines in the valley. Unfortunately, it burnt down some years ago. It has since been rebuilt. Reading a script at Ziyarat Dastgir Sobun. Proverbs fall from the saint's upturned bowl. Beneath the cypress, work is a steel gray word. Thought is plum and prayer a mournful green. A cube with 3 lacquered walls and a broken face holds them together. The almond merchant shuffles past the lake without humming. The singer hides his voice under a scarf. The guide won't admit to his compass. They're actors in a long-running movie about comets in which a pair of hands wash themselves at a fountain over and over, the soundtrack worn out, silence dripping from the stripped chinar and the charred roof to the headstones buried in snow. And since I'm in that kind of moment, I'm going to now read a poem called The Calligrapher's Bequest. Again, I'm sure we'll talk about this in a while, Arshia, but so much of this comes out for me from moments of epiphany made in the middle of displacement. You find yourself very far away, as I found myself here in a museum in Berlin, looking at an exhibition of the treasures of the Aga Khan's collection. And one of them was this incredible piece to which I felt impelled to respond. So this is called The Calligrapher's Bequest. All green has gone from the broad chestnut leaf pinned behind glass, a fan of dried veins with the name of God brushed across it in swirling currents of gold, in swirling currents of gold, one of 1,000 hopes, all 1,000 mixed in each. My shadow falls across these dancing strokes and evaporates. The slant afternoon light is raining through the barred panes, through the eclipse of my body on this dead leaf that carries the most beautiful word. And I'll end on a slightly different note. Again, this has to do with how do you tell your story? What's the beat? What's the tempo? Who is listening? So this is called, I do see that there are 33 people listening, so I'm greatly relieved. But the strange, this is called the strange case of Mr. Narrative's reluctance. And it goes like this. What shall I do with your silences, master? Your gray eyes glowing in a wall of sour cement, the darkness in your blood, your arsonist's handshake. Shall I hold the girl running a hoop through the square, grip the lighthouse looming at the end of the street, seize the shadow of the man puffing a pipe as it lengthens on a hot brick wall, grasp the ivy that crusts on cool, high windows? The water is crumpling in your hands. Too much leaks into the world. You think too much. You are coming apart at the seams. Your buttons are going off like gunshots. Let it spill, master. You cannot hold back. The goldfish exploding from your shirt front. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bravo, bravo. As we say in Sanskrit, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you.
Yeah. You know, we've known each other's work more closely than we've known each other for just about 30 years, Ranjit.
This is true.
No, and I mean, for me, it's nothing is more exciting than listen to a colleague become better and better and better at what they do. And your poetic voice is just soaring. I mean, these last works are very moving, but they have a majesty to them as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's you know, sometimes you have friends whose work gets worse as they age. You are not one of them.
This is very good to hear.
So what we're going to do is we don't have a whole lot of time. So I'm going to ask Ranjit a couple of questions, and then we'll take maybe a couple of questions from the people who are listening, and then we'll wrap up. So it's a very particular selection that you chose for tonight, and I believe that it is incredibly pointed. But what and you've chosen from, you know, many years of writing, from over a decade of writing. So why these poems, and why these poems now?
Thank you so much. In the first place, thank you for your wonderful response to my poetry. And also, yes, we've traveled together in some sense through our work more than ever through conversation, which is now happening. But the question, yes, I did look back across my books, and some of the earliest poems really do go back to the early and the mid-90s. And it just struck me that I wanted to share a set of poems that have to do with urgencies that have been with us, that are getting more dramatic, more sinister in some ways. And also not to make a great point of it, but to simply put it out there that as poets, we are far more deeply concerned with what is around us than otherwise. Because sometimes people tend to think of poetry as a place of escape, but I see it as a place of bearing witness. And I see it very strongly as someone with my particular beliefs, which are inclusive, which believe in, I believe in dialogue and encounter, the confluence of surprisingly dissimilar things. That is what I prize in our history, which is, as you know, far more complex than we imagine it to be, or that we're being told it is. So for me, this is an important responsibility. I take it as a responsibility in my poetry. So I would reach out to places, to predicaments, to people in this way. So Dome, for instance, is an elegy for the Babri Masjid. It's more than an elegy for a building. It's an elegy for an ideal of how to live and work and be together and to find confluential ways of being. Yeah, and it was just a deeply felt reaching out to a friend who had suffered trauma. I mean, in the end, of course, you know that many people suffer trauma, but you feel it through the people who are around you. And to me, it was also that. It was a way of articulating, a way of standing with.
Yeah, you know, the other thing that I found interesting as your work has grown and as the world around you, around us, all of us has changed, I'm seeing in your work that there's a simultaneous increase of introspection and a simultaneous engagement with externality. Your work is becoming much more political over the years. And I think, you know, that's true of all of us. We don't have a choice. We must be political in this moment. But also, I'm going to take a bit of a risk and stick my neck out and say that I felt that after translating Lalla, after your magnificent translation of Lal Ded, something happened. I think your work has changed since that encounter. And I think it's changed in two ways. I see you writing more and more about mystics. I see you writing more and more about the internal experience. And I see Kashmir as a leitmotif, you know, more and more in your work. So if you'd like to tell us about the Lalla translation and if I'm right or wrong, yeah.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think the process of working on the translation, which, as I've said often enough, and my friends rib me about it, it took about 20 years.
Yeah.
Sorry, not 20 consistent years of being focused on the translation, but it also, which is why when I call it a project, I then stop myself short and say, well, it was really much more. It was like a life project. So it involved going back. It began in the first place with a general notion of wanting to recover some aspect of a lost homeland and a lost language. But very soon it moved well beyond any such ethnocentric preoccupation or nostalgia. I was far more preoccupied with also the time of when I got down to this. I began this work at the beginning of the 90s. So it went, the 20 years that I did that work were also 20 of the worst years that Kashmir has ever seen.
Yeah.
In not just from 1947, but in about 500 years of continuous conflict and violence of one kind or another. You know, people who think it's all shikaras and lakes often miss out on this fact that it's been an incredibly violent, conflicted society with incursions, invasions, internal dissensions, and yet has produced magnificent art, philosophy, literature. So there's this deep sense of empathy with the place, the people, the language, and the predicament. So yes, so Kashmir has become a very strong presence for me in this way. And I was transformed also in terms of how I thought about these questions of spirituality, of quest. Because although I was brought up with a very eclectic notion of what the religious imagination might be, you know, the family has some connections with Theosophy and J. Krishnamurti. There's a Shaivite strand. The books of all religions and traditions were available to me as a child. I mean, my parents, it was part of their agenda for me in a sense.
Yeah.
They wanted me to be aware of what happened in Islam, Sufism. There was a picture Bible, Buddhist stories, and so on and so forth. So I was, you know, when I look back, I just think, my goodness, how can people bring their children up with narrow concepts of religion and religious identity? So my experience was one of expansiveness in that regard. But then as a student, like many of us, I went through a leftist phase. And that's when I began to translate. And my whole first round of translation, which I threw away, was caught up with how do I get this vocabulary across into something that might be acceptable in a secular context. And over the years, I've learned to, and I very soon realized that this was nonsense, because that was central to Lalla's and her tradition. It's Vox. So I was not going to be Procrustes and trim that to my particular politics. I was going to change, and I did. And not only in an instrumental way. I just went on a journey, and you know, I just opened myself up to many different traditions. In a way, it was a retrieval of that childhood past. And so it wasn't just the vocabulary, it was the practices, the concepts, the lived experience of what it means to be a sadhak, what it means to be a kalandar. And this was for me the great transformation, personally, in a completely private sense. So I now occupy a rather strange ground. If people ask me whether I'm a secularist, in the first place, I think that word has lost its meaning because it means everything to everyone. So I have a private sense of spiritual belief, but instead of cutting me off from other people and their beliefs, it actually allows me to be inclusive and ecumenical in my understanding of why people believe in what they believe. Sorry, very long answer.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. Thank you for your candor. And I hope also that people who are listening are inspired by this idea, that if you're truly spiritual, it connects you with people rather than cuts you off from them. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to well, we're very tight in these last couple of minutes, but I'll ask you, I want to talk a little bit about the calligrapher's request, right?
Right.
And what a beautifully delicate poem that is, and how it actually, form and content are matching. There's a sense of the easy flow of a calligrapher's pen, the creation of an image. How does the poem come to you? I mean, if you look at calligrapher's request, and then you look at the one you read just after, Mr. Narrative, so different in tone, in attitude, in mood, in who is being spoken to, and your own position in relation to who you're speaking to. How does a poem come to you? How do you shape it? Yeah.
It works differently for different poems. I think in general, my process is one of working with fragments and notes that get built up over the years in my journals. And then sometimes there's a compelling energy that brings fragments from different times of my life together.
Yeah.
But sometimes, like with the calligrapher's bequest, it was one very, very powerful moment of being in the presence of this chestnut leaf, almost threadbare, but with incredible golden calligraphy. And just the way it embodied in that flash a wager on something that is timeless, immortal, transcendent, on something that is mortal, subject to decay. Okay, conservators are saving it, but it's a leaf. And you can see its venation falling apart if it wasn't held together. So what is it that prompts the artist to make this wager on the timeless, on something that is mortal? That just struck me, and I just found myself I didn't let go till the poem was written, actually. That's one of those poems where this actually happened. I worked on it for about 3 days and it was there. But with the other poem, that actually started with painting. It's certain paintings of Kirikos, certain paintings of Magritte's, and just the curiosity of entering a strange, surreal landscape and wondering about the play of scale. And then you suddenly realize that if you walk out into your own street, you might be perturbed in the same kind of way. So that was different.
But certainly calligrapher's request seems to have this quality of sphota,
Yes.
the explosion of meaning.
Yes.
Right? That is actually what every artist waits for, no?
Yes.
Whatever medium you create your art, that is it, really.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to ask Harish to maybe take comments or responses from the people who are listening in. But Harish, maybe no more than 1 or 2 comments, please, because I'm keeping an eye on the time.
Okay. So Vanshika Singh has asked, what was the last poetry named? As in, like, the last poem Mr. Ranjit read. It was from the comments.
Okay. I'll just put that in there.
Yeah. And then people were saying lovely and all that for the rough shrubbery of her speech. That verse, beautiful and all that. Yeah. So there is a question from an anonymous attendee. Have you found yourself reacting as a poet to the contagion, lockdown, and quarantine? To the circumstances as they affect all of us, the world we live in, as well as your inner self?
Very much so. I think all of us have in common this exact occurrence. It's the kind of thing that you might have read about in H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds or some apocalyptic fiction. We are all, wherever we are on the planet, united. For once, we are united by something, but it's a deeply negative thing. And of course, I think as we've all gone through these phases of solitude, anxiety, particularly I think with many of us, anxiety about loved ones who are far away or older, So I think we've all been brought face to face with our common humanity here. So I've had a lot of time to think about this. But as an artist, as a writer, I'm also dealing with the fact that it feels like an extended writing residency. And I won't deny that. The fact is that there is a certain measure of repose where you can actually focus on things that the momentum of normal life doesn't allow you to focus on. So it's been a shifting balance. There are times when you feel, well, not much has changed in my life. I mean, I do what I always do. I sit and read and write.
Yeah.
But then you think, oh my goodness, there are choices that I had which have been taken away. Going out, meeting friends, just traveling. I mean, that's been, so one of the effects has been a very vivid recall of places that have meant something to me over the years and childhood. So that's, those are sort of scenes from my pandemic lockdown journal. But
Funny you should mention childhood. I've been having really strong childhood flashbacks, and I was wondering why and how. It's good to know that it's happening to somebody else as well. Harish, do we have another question? Because I really want
Yes.
you
Just
to
one
read
more
my
question.
favorite poem. Yeah.
Yes, one more question. How does your art curatorial practice interact with your poetry?
you know, there was a long time when I tried to keep these various practices apart for what I thought were good professional reasons. Because sometimes you'd land up at a symposium and they'd say, oh, you know, Ranjit will now offer his poetic views on something. And I wanted to say, no, I'm taking a straightforward art historical view here. Or, you know, you got seen as the critic among poets and so on and so forth. But I gradually realized that there's no need to perform these professional differences for audiences. You just have to do what is real and true for you. And I realized that although the articulation is different in each case, there's all of these practices are nourished by the same set of journeys, the same values, the same quest. So as a curator and as a poet, I'm looking at how abstractions beyond language get incarnated in language or in materiality. I'm looking at, again, the confluence of dissimilar things. As an art curator, for instance, I'm not very interested in notions of the modern as, you know, starting at 1900 or starting with the colonial encounter. I'm far more interested in looking back at receding horizons of modernity that emerge in the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So how does that affect me as a poet and translator? Because I'm also interested in the literature that was done at that point. I write in English, but I read in several languages. I find myself very much at home, for instance, with the poetry of the Braj poets. And that in turn influences the kind of art that I'm getting interested in, the art of the late Mughal period. So there are loops that connect all these practices. So they're not flying in different directions. They're, with some luck, sustaining each other.
You're one of the fortunate people, Ranjit, that has many talents and many interests. And so, you know, all your work is enriched. I mean, your artwork is obviously enriched by your magnificent control of language. And of course, your poetry is by all the beauty that you feed your eyes with. So, so I'm gonna make an intervention and say, please read my favorite poem. And that will be the last thing that we hear from Ranjit. So thank you so very much. It's been such a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ashay. Thank you very much indeed. And yes, this is a poem for my mother, and was written as an elegy actually after she passed away, and had to do with a story that she told me many things about. She told me many versions of the story, and she was not a fan of the protagonist for reasons that will become evident. And it's called After the Story. Uttar. From the anthill came the voice. Two white birds perched on a branch, one killed by a hunter's arrow, the first poem written in its blood. The morning sage's sudden curse falls on the hunter's ear as verse. From the anthill came the voice. Prisoner on the island of his suspicions, alone under his white silk canopy, he murmurs the chants that his aging priests heap on the fire sacrifice. Then, From nowhere, two boys' voices, high flutes above the drone, dropped masks, startled faces. The boys sing. From the anthill came the voice of the golden deer in the forest, the princess carried off by the demon chief, the war, the siege, the giant red monkey cartwheeling across the sky and burning the island fortress. When the war ends, the prince fixes his wife's 14-year wait with a cold stare and an ordeal by fire. The fire plays honest witness. From the anthill came the voice, but the prince cannot bridge a distance greater than the stormy sea. Doubt again for him, again exile for her, love twisted and beaten on a washerman's stone. At last she will have had enough of his tests. She will ask the furrowed earth to swallow her. He stands up shaking, his eyes opened wide, as his children sing to the king his own story. Thank you so much.
Superb. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I request Dr. Chandraish Sarkar to deliver the vote of thanks?
Thank you so much, sir. It fills me with insurmountable wonder to such resplendent creations. And I'm sure like words beautiful is enough to tell you, what our audience went through. And I take this opportunity to thank Punjab Association, Anna Adarsh College for Women and Principal Ma'am for their support. I thank our head, Department of English, Dr. Archana M. Sardana, for arranging such splendid sessions. I thank Ranjit sir deeply for bringing us out from the mind-blowingly mundane life all of us are stuck into now. I thank Arshia ma'am for moderating the session. I thank the team behind the listening evening. I thank Meera ma'am, Santosh and Harish, Ranveer sir, Prakriti Foundation for collaborating with our college. Thank you so much.
Just a quick reminder to everybody, we have another poetry session by Dr. Rudramurthy Cheran on 19th December 2020, which is next Saturday, which is going to be our last poetry session for 2020. So do sign in. You can mail us at prakritifoundation@gmail.com. And thank you everybody for signing in and making this a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. It's been marvelous to be here.
Thank you.
Bye.